I'm not sure what I saw first. Was it the young man's vacant eyes, or was it the bullet hole next to them? 1992, South Africa is 2 years away from its first democratic election. Nelson Mandela has just been released from jail, and a power struggle is taking place between his African National Congress and the Zulu Nationalist Inkatha Freedom Party, which threatens to throw our country into a civil war. Alexandra Township, it's 500,000 black souls which are cramped by apartheid into 5 square kilometers, surrounded by the leafy white suburbs of Johannesburg. And that was going to be the epicenter for this clash. Alex is served by one clinic, and at night there's one doctor and 2 nurses. The night that I saw that young man, I was the doctor. But I was feeling pretty confident. I had Anna Makowena with me. Now, Anna is built like a small tank. She is broad and has very large fists. And when the drunk patients used to come in, Anna would say to them, "Which hand do you want? This one sends you to ICU, but this one sends you to the mortuary." Even the drunk guys actually knew they'd met their match. But on that night, we'd heard rumors that a major clash was brewing, and suddenly it began. Rifle fire split the night, and from the windows we could actually see the embers of burning fires and of buildings. And suddenly, people started to come in, carried, walking, spear wounds, bullet wounds. I find it actually quite hard to describe the horror of that evening. Dead and dying people, blood, screams, and I actually was terrified. We did the very best that we could, patched up stab wounds, put up drips, etc. And I said to Anna, "Call ambulances, we need them." And she said to me, "I have," and they say, "It's too dangerous." I said, "Okay, what about the police?" And they said, "Well, same response." So we were on our own. And in the midst of all of that trauma, this young man, bullet to the brain, his higher functions I knew had been destroyed by the bullet, and he was definitely not going to live very long. So when Anna said to me, "So what should we do with him?" Using the context and using the very best decision I could at the moment, I said, "Leave him." It was a decision that would come back to haunt me. The next morning, things had quietened down, and the head doctor joined me for a review of the patients that were still left at the clinic. We get to this young man. He's still alive. And I explained to the doctor my reasoning for leaving him. And his normally quiet demeanor suddenly explodes. "You did what? You just left him to die? If he'd been white, you'd have treated him. But no, because he was black, you left him." I tried to explain the context and how I'd done the very best I could, had nothing to do with race. But he was having none of it. His tirade continued. "I've seldom felt so misunderstood, so stereotyped, and so hurt." All he saw was a white man that had inflicted, I represented everything that had inflicted pain on him and his people. And in that moment, I was so angry that all I saw was a black man that basically lumped me in with every other white racist he'd ever met. Now, it was an awful, awful situation, and it could have ended differently. But how? Well, he and I had worked together for quite a long time, but beyond the sort of normal pleasantries, I'd never bothered to get to know his story, nor he mine. But had I bothered, I'd have found out that actually he, as a young man in his opposition to apartheid, had been exiled from the country of his birth. And in order to make a difference when he returned to the people, he had done medicine. And that when he returned, instead of going back into a lucrative private practice, he had chosen to work amongst the poor of Alexandria. And if he'd heard my story, he found out too that I too had done medicine to work in places like Alex. And that I wanted in some way to use the privileges that my whiteness had bestowed on me to make a difference to the people of my country and to repair some of the damages that apartheid had created. And I wonder whether, knowing each other's stories, we would have found out that we had so much more in common than our racial differences. And whether with that understanding, that terrible morning could have played out very, very differently. Now, Zulu people have a greeting. They say, "Sawubona." Now, "Sawubona," which translated means, "I see you." And I've come to understand that if you really want to see somebody, ask them their story. Our organization, Heartlines, a South African-based NGO, has, over the last 7 years, developed a simple, scalable approach to promoting understanding and empathy. We call it, "What's Your Story?" And it has 3 simple principles. The first is to ask. Be curious and ask people their stories, those that look the same as you and those that look different. And then the one that I struggle with most is to listen without judgment, without trying to fix. And then the third one is be prepared to share your own story when asked, and even to actually spend time getting to look at your own story, which often is one of the most empowering and healing things you can ever do. Now, tens of thousands of people have used these principles in different spaces in different parts of the world. From structured engagements, people in conflict brought together over a couple of days, through to churches where, in fact, congregations don't know each other, through to families, and then also in workplaces. And the results are invariably the same, is that the other becomes human, and the space for understanding, for empathy, and even for forgiveness opens up. Evaluations, of which there have been a few, have actually consistently found that people who experience What's Your Story report a 65% increase in empathy, and that they report a willingness to look at the other's perspective. And in workplaces, over 25% of people say that their relationships with their colleagues have improved once they got to know their stories. Now, this is probably very abstract, so I'm going to leave you with this. I am a nursery school dropout. It is true. Age 4, I dropped out of my first nursery school. I lasted 1 day. And this was to set a pattern that would continue for the rest of my life. Well, not the rest of my life, but the rest of my school life. And you might sort of ask why. Was it because I was bullied? And this is an extraordinary thing. If I was a bully, I would have bullied me. But I was never bullied. But what it was is that my mother was incredibly anxious about being separated from me. And as a result, I became anxious at being separated from her. In later years, I became quite angry at her neediness and blamed her for my checkered school career. But when we were developing What's Your Story, I decided to actually go and get her story. She was 80. And as people of that age, when you ask them, she said, nothing to tell. But I sat her down and I persisted. And slowly it came out. As a young girl, she had been systematically abandoned and shuttled between families. She'd been to boarding school aged 5, and she never knew who would be picking her up at the end of term. And understanding her story gave me context into her, and my anger was replaced by actually sadness for that little girl. So is this a silver bullet for an increasingly fractious and divided world? No. But if these 3 simple words, what's your story, were practiced by enough people in enough places, we might answer the call of our time to reach across our divides and to find the humanity in each other again. Thank you.